Hotel, welcome to this live stream, which is actually in response to the commercialization of African history and culture by the archaeologist Zahi Hawass. This lecture is sponsored by the MKA Institute, and I want you to know that you can reach us at our website, themkainstitute.com. themkainstitute.com. Also, please subscribe to our channel. There's no cost to you to subscribe to this channel. This is a very important topic today. And here we are again with a contestation over ancient Africa. Egypt remains the most contested because of its monumentality, evidence of literary significance, technological advancement, and geopolitical place in the world. My name is Molefi Kete Asante. I am the author of over 100 books, actually 104 books, including The African Pyramids of Knowledge, The History of Africa, and Egyptian Philosophers. The African Pyramids of Knowledge was published by Universal Right Publications, and the Egyptian Philosophers published by African American Images, and The History of Africa published by Routledge. For those of you who are here for the first time on our channel, I will give some background, some information, because you should know exactly why it was necessary, or we thought it necessary, for us to have this conversation with the public. I've traveled to Kemet, which is the ancient name of the country that is called by the Arabs Misr, M-I-S-R, and by the Greeks Egyptus. I've traveled there at least 10 or 15 occasions since 1991. I have been all over the country. I have led groups, sometimes as large as 60 people, to Kemet. My mother's ancestry extends to the Nile Valley in Sudan, among the Mahasi. I am a professor and the creator of the first PhD program in African American Studies at Temple University. I also introduced the first two classes on the classical language of Kemet for graduate students in African American Studies. We call it after Bilolo, Professor Bilolo Chikam, and we sometimes, of course, use the textual description as Merunecha, which is actually the divine words. Chikam we take from the Bantu language structure of identifying a language and then the people. So Chikam meaning basically the language of Kemet. At one time, the courses, and I want to say this too, because those two courses that are on the books at Temple University used to alternate between Professor Theophile Obenga and myself. And when Dr. Obenga went back to Congo, I ended up teaching those courses, and now they are taught by Dr. Kimani Nehusia and myself. So I'm not unfamiliar with Kemet. That's the point that I want to make here, which is, as I've always claimed, the proper name for ancient Egypt. It's not the name that the Greeks gave to the land, which is Egyptus, but the land that the Africans gave to it was Kemet. So I've spoken on the film that was made on Cleopatra from this same program, from the Molefi Kete Asante Institute program. And I've defended it from the racists who wanted to steal African history. I have also defended and spoken here in Philadelphia in support of Calvin Hart, who was denied an opportunity to perform in Cairo because he had made the statement about ancient Egypt being a civilization of Black people. And there was no reason for anybody to deny him uh, a right to perform simply because he is claiming the truth. So this is a major issue right now in Egypt itself, in modern Egypt, because in modern Egypt, there are very few Arab historians who take the position that the ancient civilization of Kemet was a Black civilization. And so what that means is that we have an unusual situation where people have occupied a country over several hundred years, and then they have, in effect, sought to claim that ancient civilization as theirs. It's almost like the Europeans in the United States claiming the civilization of the Navajo people, the Dene people in New Mexico, or the Spaniards in South America claiming the civilization of the Aztec, or the Mayans in Central America, and so forth. This normally doesn't happen, but it has happened particularly in the case of Kemet, in the case of Egypt. This has happened. And I just want to give another piece of information, which I think is very important and very useful for those who don't know this story. The arrival in the 7th century, this era, which is sometimes called the Common Era, in the 7th century, the arrival of Arabs under the leadership of General El Az brought in, for the first time in Kemet, brought in Arab people en masse. And not only did they come to help the Africans on their request to help them actually kick out the Romans, but they remain in Kemet. They remain in Egypt, and they built the city of Cairo, which is the first Arab city built in Egypt. And so they built Cairo, and they built it. It was a fortress. They remained there as a very significant population, and then gradually began to take over the country. Almost all of the country was taken over in the next 100 years. And then, of course, they began to encroach upon Sudan. And one of the things that we know is that it took actually much longer for Sudan to fall under this influence, because the Sudanese had fought very long and very hard. And it was only around the 16th century that Sudan was finally defeated. But it's important to understand this history, because if you don't understand this history, then you don't understand Zahi Hawass. Hawass is the ringmaster who seeks to downplay and therefore distort the Black African history of Egypt. He has done this for many years. And I often think that perhaps it was his education or his lack of education in the United States, because he was basically educated right here at the University of Pennsylvania. And University of Pennsylvania, during the time he was in school here, was not certainly a bastion of liberal or multicultural thinking. And Hawass came here, studied archaeology, and basically became, for Egypt, their principal spokesperson for a time about the antiquities of ancient Kemet. Now, the reason the Molefi Kete Asante Institute decided that it was important to speak to this issue at this moment is because since May, Zahi Hawass has been traveling around the world giving lectures, talking about he was going to give people information about the great mysteries of ancient of Kemet, of Egypt. And this is all to me a commercial operation. And because it's a commercial operation, it not only distorts Black history or African history and culture, but it also cheapens the concepts and the ideas, the philosophy, the notions that were fundamental to the moral and aesthetic ideas of ancient Africa. They're cheapened by what he's doing. Uh, Almost 20 years ago, uh, he came to Philadelphia to the Franklin Museum during an exhibition on King Tutankhamun. And there was a demonstration. We had a big demonstration outside of the museum. We called it a crime scene because we said all you would be hearing are lies and they would be distorting African history. And in fact, it was wonderful because one of the venerable journalists, African American journalist in Philadelphia, a woman by the name of Helen Blue, pursued Hawass throughout the Science Museum as he was surrounded by so many people, and she questioned him several times about the who were the ancient Egyptians? Were they Black? Were they Black? And he finally, out of anger, said to her, "Yes, they were Black. So what?" She said, "Well, you have avoided telling the audiences that King Tutankhamun was Black. And I've listened to you these days that you've been here, and you have not done that." The problem is that Hawass was, I'm not sure he was intentionally telling a warped narrative. You could say that if he knew the truth, and I think there's enough information for him to know the truth. Before 70,000 years ago, let's just lay these facts out again. Before 70,000 years ago, all humans were Black. Before 70,000 years ago, all Homo sapiens were Black. All Homo sapiens were on the continent of Africa, coming from the continent of Africa. Phenotypical color changes occurred after 70,000 years ago, after Homo sapiens, Black Homo sapiens from Africa, migrated from the continent of Africa to various other parts of the world. So the earliest people, the so-called indigenous people of every continent, Asia, Europe, Africa, were these these Black Homo sapiens. Uh, I think most of you who are listening know some of this history, but let me just make this clear. Humanity arose, that is, Homo sapiens. There were other humanoids, human-like creatures prior to Homo sapiens, but Homo sapiens, that's all the 8 billion people that we have on the earth today. Homo sapiens arose about 300,000 years ago, according to science, according to the DNA. So about 300,000 years ago, you get Homo sapiens. Most of the time of Homo sapiens was spent on the continent of Africa. That means at least 230,000 years was spent before humanity or Homo sapiens left the continent of Africa. That period we have called the Mesuit, Mesuit, the Mesuit. That period, the Messuite, was a period of cultural formation. This is where humanity learned how to cross rivers, how to feed their young, how to shelter themselves, how to create relationships and sustain them, how to travel with the direction because of the stars and the planets. This was a human affair. And during the time, roughly from 300,000 years ago, to the time that there was this migration out of Africa, we're talking about uh, African people, Black people, actually creating all of these elements and all of these traditions. After the migration started, most Black people, however, remained in Africa. Egypt, which rises around 3,400 before the Christian era, as it's called, BCE. Uh, Egypt, which arises about that time, is part of Africa. Egypt is not a part of Europe. It is not a part of Asia. There is no continent called Middle East. It is actually not in America. It is not in Asia. Egypt is a part of Africa, and it is a constitutive part of Africa because the Nile River, which starts in the deep part of Eastern Africa, flows northward. It's one of the few rivers in the world that flows northward, big rivers, flows northward to the Mediterranean, down to the Mediterranean from the upper, the highlands of Uganda and Rwanda and those areas, and it flows down through Sudan, and then it is energized by the Abe River, which comes from Lake Tana in Ethiopia and gives it its power and energy, and it pushes it down through Sudan, northern Sudan, and through Egypt into the Mediterranean. This you need to know, because if you don't know that, when people talk about Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, it's sometimes confusing, because Lower Egypt is the northern part of Egypt. The upper part of Egypt is the south. South is where the civilization starts, and it goes down the river. It doesn't go up the river, it goes down the river. And in fact, the founder of Kemet, the leader of the nation, the person who created the nation, who conquered 42 different ethnic communities and molded them into one nation, was a man by the name of Menes from the south. So Menes is a great leader, the great champion. And I wonder sometimes, I often wonder, why is it that we don't learn in school about the person who created the first nation? Why is it we don't learn about Menes? And again, the answer is that, oh, well, he's a Black man. So they certainly, in the Western education, don't want to tell you the first person to create a nation, to bring all these different groups together under one umbrella, was an African, and that was Menes, the great conquering king who gave us the country of Kemet. So this is important. I tell you what Zahi Hawass will not mention. He will not mention Miriam Ma'at Kare Manghez. He will not mention the woman, the scholar who wrote the book Kush, the Jewel of Nubia. He will not mention her. I'll tell you something else. I don't care what lecture you go to hear him. I'll tell you what he will not do. He will not mention Sheikh Anta Diop, who wrote The African Origin of Civilization. He will not mention Sheikh Anta Diop, who wrote Civilization of Barbarism, an authentic anthropology. And yet, Zahi Hawass calls himself an archaeologist. And he also says things like, he's the world's greatest archaeologist. Wait a minute. No, he is a person who spent most of his life actually at Giza, at the pyramids, and not only spending his life there, but also taking, as some of the Egyptians told me, taking advantage of other people's discoveries and claiming that they are his. There are many issues with Zahi Hawass, and I'm not going to get into that. I just want to say that fundamentally, this man has always tried to deny the African origin of the civilization of Kemet. That's his biggest problem. He won't mention Theophilo Obenga. I'm sure in the lectures that he's giving around the world on Kemet, he will not mention Shamarka Kieta. He will not mention Charles Finch. I am sure he will not mention Anthony Browder. He will not mention even the discussions and discourses that Greg Carr is having. He will not mention Sally Ann Ashton. He will not mention Robert Bauval or Thomas Brophy. And I'm telling you that he will not mention these people, these numerous scholars who have argued positions and who have spoken straight to the issues that supposedly he is interested in about ancient Kemet. He will not mention them. He will not mention Jacob Carruthers or Maulana Karinga or Mario Beatty. He definitely won't mention Karinga, who wrote the massive book on Ma'at, the moral ideal in ancient Kemet, which is, even until this day, the most profound philosophical book written about ancient Kemet. So if you're going to talk about Kemet and you don't talk about Willie Cannon Brown, who wrote the book Nefer, the aesthetic ideal in ancient Egypt, if you don't talk about these African scholars who have written on this stuff, then what you're trying to do is to mislead the public and to give them false information. He will not refer certainly to any of my books on Egypt, not even the Egyptian philosophers. And the Egyptian philosophers is a first book that we have in English dealing with the ancient Egyptian philosophers who were philosophers long before any European philosopher, long before any Arab philosopher. The Egyptian philosophers, these are African philosophers who lived on the continent of Africa. Not only lived there, but observed and wrote about their experiences and also tried to teach humanity how to live their lives. He won't mention the African pyramids of knowledge. Now, let me just say a little bit about the let's say basically about both of these things, the Egyptian philosophers and the African pyramids of knowledge. And let me talk first about the Egyptian philosophers. The earliest philosopher that we know of was Imhotep. Now, all school children should know Imhotep. This is a human being who built the first pyramid. That's the architect who built the first pyramid. This is a black man, and he is not in the text so that people can see that this is an African contribution. You will not see that. You will not even hear a Hawass talk about Imhotep, this African philosopher, not an Arab philosopher, not a European philosopher, not an Asian philosopher, somebody right from the continent, a black man, was the first builder of the pyramid. No pyramid existed in Kemet in Egypt before he built the first one. So that's important. But it was not just Imhotep as a philosopher. Amenhotep, the son of Hapu, is said to have known all there was to know in his day and age. Amenemhat, Dwarf, Mary Kari, 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 Amenhotep, who also gave us philosophy to live by, Dwarf, the philosopher Dwarf, the philosopher Akhenaten. These were philosophers who lived long before any philosopher anywhere else, long before Confucius, long before Lao Tzu, long before Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. These were African philosophers. They're at the very center of human thinking. They're the ones who give us some understanding about the world and the universe, but they have been not erased because we have kept them alive, but they have been put to the side. They have been shunted to the side. So we have to understand that. And then I wrote the book, African Pyramids of Knowledge, for one simple reason. I was tired of people saying, well, we have to always go back, and we have this problem even among ourselves, even among Afrocentric scholars sometimes. We have to go back to the classical writings and the classical myths and tropes of Europe. And so almost all contemporary scholars trained in the West know something about Greeks and Greek mythology, ancient Greeks and Greek. They don't know much about modern Greek, but they know a lot about ancient Greek and Greek mythology. That's the way it's set up. So it's set up that people start with Homer, and Homer becomes for them the key to understanding Western civilization. He opens up everything. They can understand Hellenic culture by that, because Helen of Troy. They can understand everything. That's the package. The problem with that package is that it's a limited understanding of antiquity. That this story, the story of the Iliad, or the Odyssey, is 800 years before the Christian era. That's very recent in terms of world antiquity. Because earlier than that, we understand we have the building of the first pyramid around 2700 years before the Christian era. But this is almost 2,000 years before Homer. And yet people do not start with the pyramids. To me, the classical civilization, at least for us, those of us who study African history and culture, we have to begin at the pyramids. We can't go beyond that. And we have to understand, as my friend Edgar Ridley always says, the difference between symptomatic thinking and symbolic thinking. Because the Africans who built the pyramids, they were building it out of the understanding that they had of the universe and how they saw themselves in relationship to eternity. So the African pyramids of knowledge includes an understanding of the pyramid, and the word in ancient Kemet is mir, and we write it mr, mir, for pyramid. The ancient understanding of this is not simply as a museum piece. The pyramid was not simply a monument that was just simply standing there to be looked at, and for one to look at the pyramidion and be swayed by all of its power. It also contained inside writing, with philosophy, with literature, with understandings of how people should conduct their lives, and paintings of all kinds that were drawn on the walls with the by the priest and so forth. It was a very, it is, of course, they have what they call pyramid texts. You've probably heard of this notion of pyramid text. The pyramid text notion, what that means is that inside all these pyramids, there is enough writing that is more writing than you can have in all of classical Europe. If you take all the Greek and Roman books that people talk about as classical literature and put them together, you will not have the number, the volumes that you would have from the pyramid texts of ancient Kemet. That's how powerful it was. And yet we sort of like want to skip around that. Even Zahi Hawass won't tell you that. I'm telling you, he will not tell you that. He will talk to you about what he dug up and how he saw this and that and so on, but he knows nothing almost about the philosophy and the concept of what was behind what he's looking at. And the reason he doesn't is because he doesn't take an Afrocentric orientation. He takes an orientation that comes out of archaeology, out of Western archaeology. That's why he made that strange statement about the shape and face and skull of King Tutankhamun. You may have seen this years ago. Was the same as somebody in Europe or northern Africa, because he claimed his idea was that somehow northern Africa was different from the rest of Africa, but Africa was a black continent beginning. And the people who are in Africa who are not black, who came later, would be people who conquered, the invaders. Those people came later to Africa, they had, when they left Africa, they were black. When they came back, they were not. So he won't show you, for example, he won't tell you about Abu or Said. He won't tell you. He won't. This city is the city that's not called Aswan. The city that's called Aswan. He won't tell you about that because the history and the culture of Kemet, the very big power of it, comes, at least for Kemet's side, from Aswan. He will probably say very little about Luxor, because Luxor was the greatest city in the world. In Luxor, of course, remember this again. This is what conquerors do. They love changing the names of things. This is like, Trump said, we're going to call the Gulf of Mexico, we're going to call it the Gulf of America. They do that and they make it stick because they have military power. So this is basically what happened to Kemet. If I ask you about the city of Abu, you would know. If I asked you about Abu Island, you would know, because what did they do? They changed the name. And so now we call it Aswan. But if I ask you about the great city of the world, which was at one time the greatest city in all of the ancient world, that city was called Waset. Waset, what did they do? They changed well, the Greeks changed it first. They called it Thebes. And after the Greeks called it Thebes, then the Arabs conquered, and they called it Luxor. And so today we call it Luxor. In fact, in Las Vegas, they got a hotel they call the Luxor. And that's all because they took these African names and they changed them. It's just like the city of Menefer. The city of Menefer is the same city that they named. Can you believe this? That in the United States of America, they have a city that's called Memphis. And what the Greeks did to Menefer, they changed the name of it and called it Memphis. Memphis, an African city, is the name of the city in Tennessee called Memphis. That comes from an African city, Menefer. But do the people of Memphis know? No. Memphis, they may even think Memphis is Greek, but it was the Greek way of changing the African name Menefer, the beautiful wall. They took that name and then they changed it to Memphis, you see. And then so even segregation is in Memphis. So we happen to have, I would name our city Memphis, right? It's an African name. So he won't tell you about that. I'm telling you, Zahi Hawass will not tell you even about the African wig room. When I have taken groups, many groups, and others of you have done this too, I'm sure, who've taken groups to Kemet. In the old museum, they've just opened up the new museum, but in the old museum, which had been started by the French, that old museum had a room that was called the wig room. But you couldn't, if you didn't ask somebody, you couldn't, you wouldn't know where to go to find the wig room. Because the wig room was sort of hidden. It was not on a tour guide would not take you to the wig room. It was one of those places that I found by wandering around in the museum myself. And then I would take all my groups to the wig room. Why? Because in the wig room, all you saw was African hair. And all the wigs were African hair. So it is a stunning thing. I am not sure, given the direction that I saw happening in Egypt, I am not sure that the Arab government or people in charge, custodians, still have the wig room in the new museum. When you go, those of you who will go before me there, go there and ask them, you want to see the wigs and see what they have done, because I have pictures of the African wigs. All this was a powerful thing, but it was not seen. All the white tourists coming from Italy and Greece and Russia would not see the wig room. They would not be shown the wig room. But all the African American tourists who were with people who come from the time of Yosef ben Yochanan, we would go and we would see the African wig room. It's extremely important to see. So I'm telling you this, that Hawass will not tell you that Egypt was a Black African civilization. He would never say that. He would not say that because the Arab establishment in Egypt would be shocked, particularly since so much of what they have done is to attack the African population of Egypt and to sideline the African people so much in that country. So that some people go to Egypt and come back and say, well, I didn't see any Black people. Well, there are Black people all over Egypt, and there are definitely Black people in the southern part of the country. And those people have been there for thousands of years. He doesn't show, Zahi Hawass will not show you the connectivity between Kemet and Kush and other African civilizations. He would act as if somehow Kush and Kemet were on different continents, when in fact they flowed into each other. The confluence of those cultures was such that there was such intermingling between these two Black civilizations, not one Black and one white. They were both Black civilizations in antiquity. So people say, well, how could that be? They fought each other. I said, just like France and Germany fought each other, and they're two white civilizations. That's how Kush and Kemet were. They were civilizations that were contiguous to each other. And so, yes, there were times that they had differences and conflicts. But for the most part, that civilization remained the same basic civilization. And the Kushite civilization was what restored the civilization of Kemet when they were losing it. It was the Kushite people who understood the ancient traditions of Kemet. So it's extremely important because during the whole period when the development of the mythos during the Messuite, you have on the walls of the cave paintings in in Africa, particularly the Ineti in Chad and the Tassili in Algeria. You have these paintings, and some of these paintings have hieroglyphics on them. And you say, wow, this was before writing. I guarantee you that Zahi Hawass will not mention the work of Luca La Sala in Kuka. And Luca La Sala in Kuka, much like Bilolo and Teofilo Benga, these are Congolese scholars who do deep and powerful work on showing the interconnectivity of African civilizations. And in Kuka's work is some of the most exciting because he goes back to look at the relationship between the Bakota and the Bakongo and the ancient Kemetic people. He has he's a very brilliant brother. Brother says that and he has a theory called theory of devolution. He says one system can replace another, and one people can replace another on the ground and try to take over the concepts. And I think about this theory of devolution when I think about what happened to ancient Kemet. What happened to ancient Kemet after the 7th century takeover of Kemet by Arab civilization was that there was almost a systematic devolution. There was a system to try to take down, to demolish everything, including the places of worship and reverence and so forth. Now, I must say this, and some people who hear this may not understand or like this, but this is true. However, before, and I write about this in the history of Africa, before the Arabs came, the Christian ideology had also undermined the ancient African civilization. And not only had they undermined it, but the Christian religion, starting from the city of Alexandria, had gone throughout the country, destroying as many temples of ancient African history and culture as they could. This job was to be left to be finished by the Arab culture, but the Christian culture, mainly out of Alexandria, and because of the Coptic Church, also began a big replacement on the ground of African cultural elements. This is extremely important stuff for you to know and to realize. The capture of symbols, the distortion of symbols, this is a source, as Ridley always would say, the source of conflict. Flags, you create the flag. And in fact, the representation of God in the ancient Medo-Neter, Chicam language is like a flag. It's a flag. That's where we get the flag from anyway. That's what people, the symbol of Neter is the flag. And this was what the military would go into war with. We would go with different flags. You see, we hold the flags up and go into battle with their flags. So that's why the Neter is like that. And so people fight these symbols. People fight over this. But if you know that, if you understand this, you will also understand that Zahi Hawass has no respect for what was done by Boval and Brophy when they discovered Naphtha again. And they wrote their book Black Genesis, talking about this place where that was before Menes established Kemet in 3400 BC or thereabouts. Before that was Naphtha, which is now out in the desert. But that was a place that obviously it had great circulation of humanity working and trying to align sculptures with the stars, with the sky. But even before Naphtha, now this is This is sort of off of Kemet. This is South Africa in Mpumalanga. You have Inzalo Ilanga that is said to be 100,000 years old. I told you humanity starts 300,000 years old. Oh, but they have dated Inzala Ilanga to 100,000, which leaves 200,000 before. But that's old, and all of that is much older than Kemet. But Kemet is important because it is the monumental flourishing of African thoughts coming from the south, going down the river. That's the power of it. The notion that they have to try to erase African history in today's Egypt is one of the worst intellectual uh, distortions or dishonest things that you can think of. Nubia, Kush, Ethiopia, Meroe, Somalia, or Punt, all these civilizations are interconnected and they all represent African achievement. Colonialism always seeks to erase the civilizations that existed before, whether Arab or Europeans, they do the same thing. They want to control the narrative of the pyramids in Egypt. So you can do a lot of things. Initially, they used to say, well, aliens built them because the idea was that Africans could not build a pyramid. How could the African build a pyramid? We enslaved Africans, right? So how can they build a pyramid? So to keep the African out of the picture, you say, well, aliens built them. Aliens came out of the sky and built these pyramids and then left. And then if you say, okay, but we can show you that human beings built them because we got documents. They say, well, no, it was the Arabs. But then you say, well, but the Arabs didn't even come into the 7th century, this era. They were not even there in the BCs. So they just came. So how do they do it? Particularly when we know that the earliest pyramid was around 27 or 2800 BC. There were no Arabs in Kemet at that time. There were only black people. And we know that Lake Tana in Ethiopia provides 80% of the water to Egypt. It comes from Lake Tana. Ethiopia, in fact, is the main source of Egypt's water. And people forget that sometimes. I want to say something else, and I'm going to try to bring this to an end. But all early representatives of gods were black. All founders of all religions in antiquity were black. I'm telling you this because Higgins was correct. In Anacalypsis, what did he say? He said, the further we go back and the more we look, we found the black complexion in every case when we go to the beginning. It's all back there. It's as far as you go. All the images of the divine are black, the farther back you go in humanity. It's logical. It's logical because humanity was black. The pyramids, these repositories of African wisdom, are important and significant. And I think Hawass is an unfortunate representative of Egypt. He does not know the language as far as I can. I've followed him and watched his videos and lectures. He doesn't know Chicam. And he doesn't know the philosophy of Africa. He doesn't know the interconnection between the civilization of Ethiopia and Kush and Meroe and Kemet. In fact, he wants to isolate Egypt as if it is a singular civilization only identified with Arab people and Arab culture. That is totally misleading and is false on the basis of it. This is what the Europeans tried to do before the Arabs, because the Europeans, when they discovered ancient Kemet, in the 1700s and so on, they were saying, how could the Africans have built this civilization? How could this be? This could not be them. It had to be somebody else. I mean, and even if it were them, then it's not African. And this is why school children in Buffalo, New York, once told me when I asked them, on what continent is Egypt? And they said Europe. These were sixth graders. And the only reason they would have that image that Egypt was somehow in Europe was because that was the ideology that had been promoted over and over again, that Africans could not build this civilization. Of course, that's a stupid idea. I mean, Africans knew all along that this was a stupid idea, but this was the idea that Europe promoted. And so once Europe had lost that battle, and they lost it to Sheikh Anta Diop and Teofilo Obenga in 1974 at the Cairo conference on the peopling of Egypt. They lost that battle then, but they lost it over and over again. I mean, it is a silly argument. I mean, particularly even if you go back and you look at Herodotus, Apollodorus, and all those people who talk about the ancient Kemetic people being black skinned and so forth, you would lose that battle. But they still were trying to maintain that it's Europe who created these pyramids. And of course, Europe never recreated them in Europe. If they created them in Africa, then when they went to Europe, they didn't recreate the pyramids. This was not correct, you see. One's behavior gives you an idea always of what they believe. Zahi Hawass tells you about the construction of the pyramids, saying often in the past that people did not, he used to say, people didn't know how they did it. Well, don't say that. People knew how it was done. And he didn't know the real meaning of the pyramids, that it was not in the construction, but in the philosophy. It was in the meaning of this, you see. It was it was actually in the concepts. It was that the monumentality was simply a reflection of what people thought, you see. And one can study ancient Kemet by word lists, looking at lists of words from different cultures, colonial writings, hairstyles. And I mentioned that to you. Names of places, herding practices, burial practices, the belief in the afterworld, kingship practices. And I've looked at all of this. I've done this. And we can look at the languages, you know, and try to understand the language of ancient Kemet, you see, because there's a relationship between Chicam, Zulu, for example, and Luba, or Isa Zulu, and Luba, and Wolof, and many other languages. There are correspondences. And there's an interesting other notion that I want to just leave you with too, and that's the notion of Septepi. The Septepi is a part of the Mesuite in this sense. The Mesuite would be the physical period of time between the origin of Homo sapiens uh, all the way to the period perhaps of agriculture around 1200 BCE, or you can take it all the way down to the period of writing, which is around 3400 BCE. They call the Mesuite. But what the ancient Kemetic people had in their philosophy was something called Septepi. And Septepi was the time before time. It was the it was it was that occurred, that happened, that prepared, that created, that organized everything. And then when time came, then everything starts. You see, that was a deep philosophical concept. And in fact, on the walls of some of the temples, you will see this. Ed Fu will tell you this, that there was a time when there was this great battle between Set and Heru. This was during the Septepi. This is not in contemporary time. This was a time before time that they had this, you see. And there are stories of Alsa and Alset that exist before time began. Time begins when Heru takes the throne and becomes this king, you see, who is in charge. This Purah, the great house. Robert Bauval, who wrote the book Secret Chamber, before he and Brophy wrote their book Black Genesis, he argues that the ancient text proclaims great is the Ma'at, enduring in its effectiveness, for it has not been changed since the time of Osa. This is the time of Osa, is the first time. That's a Septepi, you see? Time before time. The first time, then when time really starts, it's the second time. But first time, Septepi, that's the time. This Ma'at existed. It endured. It has not been changed since that time. This, it really excites me to talk about this because it's the ideas that matter. You see, Sahara was not always desert. We know that. And you can't just think that that there were no civilizations before Kemet. There were, you see. And those civilizations influenced Kemet. Apollodorus, who lived in the first century before this era, said that Egypt was a country of black people. And he said that Egyptians captured the country of the black-footed ones and called it Egypt after himself. This was a Greek writing. This, of course, that's a Greek thing. But Kemet was what the people called it. Aristotle said, who was a disciple of Plato, in a naive way, showed that the Egyptians were black. He says those who are too black are cowards. This is what Aristotle wrote this in Physiognomonica. I remember it, reading it when I was a student. He says, those who are too black are cowards, like, for instance, the Egyptians and the Ethiopians. But those who are excessively white are also cowards, as we can see from the example of women. The complexion of courage is between the two. So that's where he puts the white man. You see what I mean? That is naive and stupid, but he's letting you know that the Egyptians and the Ethiopians are the same complexion. They're both black. And that Herodotus, of course, had also said that in the 5th century BC, because he says very interestingly that the people of cultures were blacks, and that they were black because they had black skin and woolly hair, that they were Egyptians, he said, because they have black skin and woolly hair. And that some people told him, this is what Herodotus says, he says some people told him that they were the descendants, these Colchians were the descendants of the soldiers of Sennacherib. Sennacherib was the Purah, the Pharaoh general, who had led an army all the way over to the Black Sea. So I'm just saying to you that there's so much more to know than what Zahi Hawass will tell people. He will not tell people the information that is necessary for them to have an understanding of anything about life. The ritual of initiation, the whole notion of libation, Kemani Nehusi, one of my colleagues talks about it in his book, Libation, an African ritual of heritage in the circle of life. If you don't have that book, you ought to get that book. An African ritual of heritage in the circle of life. That libation goes all the way back. This ritual of initiation is all over Africa. All people do it. all the communities. And all communities strive to achieve the ultimate good and truth. That's the African concept. That's the Ma'atic concept. Nadav, another colleague of mine, talks about Ma'aticity. The notion of trying that to be human is to live truth, righteousness, justice, order, harmony, balance, and reciprocity. Ma'at. And so that's Ma'aticity. We strive for Ma'aticity. The Africans talked about the doctrine of transmigration of the soul and reincarnation. This was talked about by Africans before anybody in the world. The concept of the God King, or the God Queen, that was African. This was, and also a couple of other things. The idea of aspiring for great good, because if you are good, you're looking for health and wealth and long life, and goodness is what helps to bring all this thing. And you see this every day. I mean, the Yoruba culture believes in this very deeply. That to be good, you will have health, wealth. And you have to also have some understanding about the fact that if Africans had not been enslaved by the Arabs first and then by the Europeans, you would not have people who will be trying to sideline Africa in its own classical civilization. That is the craziest thing in the world, it seems to me. But that is exactly what Zahi Hawass and many of his colleagues who have attacked me and Obenga and Sheikh Anta Diop in the newspapers. I've read it recently last year about this whole question of Kemet. He will not speak about Imhotep. He will not tell you about the first queens in the world, Sobek Nefru and Hatshepsut. They were black. He won't tell you that. And I'm saying all of this to tell you that this guy is responsible for trying to kneecap African culture and history at every turn. Like the Bennu bird that the Greeks call the phoenix, the Bennu, Bennu, the Bennu. The Greeks, again, I told you about renaming, they call it Phoenix. And so we got a city in Arizona called Phoenix, but it's actually an African word, African concept, the Bennu. The Bennu. We will continue to rise with truth. What then is the purpose of Hawass's lecture tour in America and elsewhere? I think it's a commercial venture. It's a commercial enterprise, not a knowledge one. It is to get more tourism for Egypt, and that's fine. I think there should be more tourism to Egypt. I don't have a problem with that. But I hope you understand that it is not about advancing an understanding of the African episteme. It is more about, from what I can understand, it is more about Hawass himself trying to promote himself as a great archaeologist. But he's an archaeologist who has a very limited understanding of ancient African history and culture and philosophy. I thank you very much for listening. We will have many more discussions and conversations with you. But as I say, please look at the Molefi Kete Asante lecture series, subscribe to it. That will help us. And also, if you want to go to our website and make a donation, you can do that at www.themkainstitute.com. I thank you very much. Hotep.